Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Today's announcement on the NHS does cap a pretty busy week for the government. And once again, it was, of course, Brexit causing most ructions in Westminster. But the world's focus at the start of the week was drawn to Singapore and that historic meeting between President Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Just to warn you, there are some flashing images in this film. This is the moment the little rocket man met the dotard. A year ago, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un were trading Twitter insults and making ominous threats. On Tuesday, they shook hands and broke bread. The American president on typically casual form.
Getting a good picture of everybody so we look nice and handsome and thin.
Beautiful. Perhaps Mr. Kim wasn't keen on the joke, or just maybe it was lost in translation. Someone once said Donald Trump might handle Brexit better.
Beautiful. I wanted a quiet walk to work. That's what I wanted.
Don't walk into the pillar.
And back in Westminster, ministers were bracing themselves for yet another parliamentary battle over Brexit.
Can you really please both sides, Prime Minister?
Dr. Lisa?
The drama started early on Tuesday, when hours before the debate began on the EU withdrawal bill, Justice Minister Philip Lee resigned.
I will be issuing a statement shortly.
Saying he wouldn't be able to look his children in the eye if he continued to support the government's current Brexit strategy.
The Brexit policy our government is currently pursuing to deliver on the 2016 referendum is detrimental to the people we were elected to serve.
That was one headache. There were plenty more for the Chief Whip trying to stave off rebellion. Over a dozen Tory backbenchers met the Prime Minister to demand a meaningful vote on whether the UK can leave the EU without a deal. On Tuesday evening, it seemed compromise had been reached.
There's an expectation that a discussion will yield some fruit, and I'm not saying it won't.
But it wasn't exactly clear which way Theresa May was leaning, towards the former Remainers or the most ardent of Brexiteers. All was revealed on Thursday when the government's new amendment made clear their hands would not be tied by Parliament.
That's a big mistake by the Prime Minister, because some will see it as a breach of trust.
There was unrest on the Labour benches too. 6 frontbenchers quit in protest over the party's Brexit policy. But the most visible parliamentary chaos was prompted by the SNP. Their MPs walked out of the Commons after a dispute between the party's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford, and the Speaker.
Very well! Very well!
They were complaining that time for debating Brexit's impact on Scotland was too short.
Hamid Khani,
Lena Belkadi,
Victoria King.
Finally, on the anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire, Theresa May apologised for not meeting the people affected when she first visited the scene of the disaster.
I'm sorry for not having met them then. I regret that.
All politics was set aside as the local community and the country remembered Grenfell's 72 victims 1 year on. Well, it's been a big week in politics, and I'm going to talk to my panel now to try and get them to explain some of what went on, because as I understand it, we had an amendment, a proposed amendment to that amendment, and then an amendment that made that unamendable, and that's just stopped making sense to anybody. We're going to talk to 2 of the key figures about it in a moment. So, Steve, help us understand what happened so we can then move on to what's going to happen next.
You've just lost our audience with that question. You do realise that. Very quickly, the meaningful vote, I can exclusively reveal, will be meaningful, because if she were to lose it, whatever the technicalities of last week and next week, the idea that she can then stand up and say, thank you for defeating me, we're now leaving with no deal, is a fantasy. The politics will take over. But, as you'll hear from Dominic Grieve, he wants the right to have a kind of what Tony Blair called a third way of amending whatever the deal is, rather than these seismic scenarios of no deal or just voting yes. And David Davis is worried that if you get that, his negotiation with Barnier is already nightmarish enough. He doesn't want Barnier to turn around and say, look, why should I give you any of this? Parliament will then amend it anyway. And that's, I think, where we're at.
And Lucy, on Thursday there was some back and forward negotiation between the former Remainer rebels and the Solicitor General over what the new amendment might say, and there were some problems with that.
Yes, well, I think we'll hear more from Dominic shortly, but it seems what was agreed in that meeting was then superseded by events with the government changing the terms that they had agreed with the rebels. To my mind, the most interesting comment made at the end of last week was by Tom Tugendhat, a Tory MP, who said all this arguing about the meaningful vote and exactly what it would entail is in some way pointless, because if government votes down the Brexit deal that Theresa May gets, then her administration will fall.
You agree with that?
I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. It's untenable, which is why they won't vote it down, because they know the alternative will be much worse for them.
OK, well, now let's get into some of what might happen next week with Dominic Grieve. So we understand what went on last week. You thought you had a deal with the government about an amendment that you could accept, then it seemed to change at the last minute, and you don't like the new wording of it. Are you open to negotiations to try and find something that both you and the government can agree on?
Just to explain first about that negotiation. Yes. The negotiation was important because I agreed in it that the idea that Parliament should be able to order the government to do something, which had been in the original amendment that had come from the House of Lords, was, and I took the government's point, going too far. So what I said...
So you moved quite far on that.
So we moved very far, and actually I said what we needed to have was a system where there was, at a number of possible crisis points, an ability to have a motion in the House of Commons where the government could say, this is the position, please back us to do X or Y or Z, and Parliament would have the power in that debate to amend the motion and to say, we agree with part of it, we don't agree with all of it. That's a perfectly normal Commons procedure.
So that motion would then be advisory on the government, it wouldn't be mandatory?
It would be advisory.
So is that really a meaningful vote?
Well, it is a meaningful vote because the government would then have to reflect on what has to be done. But what it would prevent is an immediate crisis. I mean, some people keep on saying what we want at that point is a motion of no confidence. I have to say, I think we'll need a motion of no confidence then, like a hole in the head. People need to keep calm. So to enable people to think about where they're going and the divergence that may emerge between Parliament and the government in this critical situation, which I might add might never happen, seems to me to be quite important. So that's what we agreed. I say agreed. The negotiators agreed it had to be taken back, but from my point of view, I had a really sensible outcome, and I was very pleased with it.
That you think wouldn't tie the government's hands, but would give Parliament a say. Then they came back and said the motion was going to be unamendable, that all Parliament could do was take note of what had happened.
We might as well not have done the whole negotiation.
So where does that leave you now? Are you going... The Lords are going to put back in the original wording in your amendment that you had. It'll come back to the Commons again. Are you going to vote on your original amendment? Would you accept a new compromise?
I would like to get to a point where we can look at the amendment, the agreement, the proto-agreement that I reached with the government on Thursday.
Afternoon.
The trouble is, the way ping-pong, as we call it, works in Parliament, this could take a little time to achieve unless we can shortcut it, because it's an extremely complex process by which you narrow the gap between the opinion of the Lords and the Commons. So I'm not quite sure. We might have some other votes on the way, which is a bit unfortunate, because quite frankly, we ought to get to the nub of this. Then
So you would accept the deal you thought you had on Thursday afternoon, which is an advisory vote, not a mandatory vote.
And so would as far as I'm aware, every single concerned Conservative who is part of this loose group that went to see the Prime Minister. We would all accept that.
But that offer's been withdrawn.
Well,
that's not currently
it's not
on the
what
table.
has been tabled in the Lords. What's been tabled in the Lords, I say, is pretty valueless. And the first thing I want to understand is, why has this been rejected? I hear some extraordinary suggestions. Somebody has said, oh, well, it's got to be rejected because somebody might go to court over it if Parliament and government disagree. I have to say, the past government's lawyer, this is complete nonsense. It doesn't bear any scrutiny at all. And the people I was negotiating with they would have raised it as a concern if they thought it was there, because that was the very thing we wanted to avoid. I have no desire.
And there were a lot of lawyers in that room.
There were a lot of lawyers around who've been poring over this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is sometimes, but beyond that, I don't know what the objection is, except it seems to me to be turning into a totemic issue for a small number of my colleagues on the Conservative benches who are somehow convinced that this is going to lead to some dastardly outcome. I just don't see it. What I was trying to do was to provide, in the event of a crisis at the end of this process, a sensible structure by which we can consider our options. And they seem to prefer chaos, whether that's because they think that will help a no-deal Brexit as nobody can do anything and is in paralysis. I have no idea, but I'd strongly recommend to them to look at the document. I will be around soon, which could form the basis of an agreement. And above all, I'd urge David Davis, now he's spent his nice weekend on Pennyfan, a mountain I know really well, and we share a passion for hills, that go away and look at it and talk to the government's lawyers, and he will be reassured that it doesn't do what he fears.
If the government do not move on this, will you and the other people who were discussing with the Prime Minister at the beginning of the week, are you prepared to vote against the government and risk a defeat on the government this week if that's what it comes to, if they don't compromise with you?
I'm absolutely sure that the group is quite determined that the meaningful vote pledge which was given to us has got to be fulfilled. Yes, I mean, I think that's abundantly clear. And if I were to say anything different, they would simply say, we're going on. They feel very strongly about this. And in any case, I feel very strongly about this. We've been trying to improve this complex piece of legislation, which is about process. It was interesting, and various people say...
I just want to put back to you something that you said a year ago when you said you didn't want to do anything that would either fetter the government's hands or indeed the government's right to walk away from the negotiations.
But it won't. It won't.
But Europe would be listening to you. You can't have a vote in the House of Commons where you advise the government not to accept a deal and no note of that is taken in Brussels.
Well, of course note will be taken of it in Brussels. But, I mean, I can't save the government from getting into a situation where Parliament might disagree with it. The alternative is that we've all got to sign up to a slavery clause now saying whatever the government does when it comes to January, however potentially catastrophic it might be for my constituents and my country, I'm signing in blood now that I will follow over the edge of the cliff. And that, I can tell you, I am not prepared to do.
To vote against the government's deal, if it came to that at the 11th hour, though, would in effect, I mean, we've just been hearing with the panel, I mean, not just seriously weaken the Prime Minister's authority, you could collapse the government by doing that.
We could collapse the government. And I can assure you, I wake up at 2 a.m. in a cold sweat thinking about the problems that we have put on our shoulders. I mean, the difficulty is that the Brexit process is inherently risky, really risky. Risky to our economic well-being, to our international relationships, and ultimately to our national security.
And fundamentally, you would prefer it wouldn't happen.
Well,
wasn't happening,
I would be
you? And
much
that's what people's suspicion is, that you're trying to stop it.
Well, people have got to, if I may say so, people have got to listen to each other. I've been really consistent about this. Of course, I think Brexit's a bad idea. That's why I voted Remain.
Okay.
But I'm also realistic that it's almost certainly going to happen. It could only not happen if there was a major change in public opinion. And at the moment, I have to say, I detect polarisation around the existing position, but I'm not sure that's happened. So I'm realistic about the outcomes.
Dominic Grieve, thank you very much for talking to us. Well, listening to all of that was the Solicitor General, Robert Buckland, who's been at the centre of those negotiations with Dominic Grieve this week. I can talk to him now. Thank you very much for coming in to join us. You were listening to Dominic Grieve there. He's open to negotiations with you about finding some kind of compromise. Was the language that you gave to him at the end of Thursday, where it would be, in the language, an unamendable emotion, is that the government's last and final offer?
That is where we are. I'm looking forward to the Lord's debate tomorrow. As Dominic knows, the original amendment that he tabled in the Commons has been retabled by a member of the House of Lords. And let's see what comes out. It's too early to say. The Lords can issue further amendments tomorrow, so I'm not going to predict what's going to happen, but I want to see what comes out in the wash.
Well, he had some fairly clear questions there, and the first one of which was, why was the original offer rejected? He thought you had come to a compromise where there would be a vote that wouldn't tie the government's hands, it wouldn't be mandatory, it would be advisory. He thought you'd agreed that, and then at the 11th hour, the wording was changed, and he wants to know why.
Well, we were looking at various options, and Dominic was part of the process, as I promised him on the floor of the House. But not only Dominic, other parliamentarians too have a great interest in this subject. What we want to avoid in the new year is some situation where somehow the House of Commons becomes the backstop negotiator in all of this, because the real action is in Brussels.
But how could they be if all they can do is pass an advisory motion?
Well, as I've said, an advisory motion can have a political consequence. I've used the famous Norway debate of 1940 as an example, where Chamberlain fell on a motion that this House do now adjourn. So the political power of the House of Commons should not be underestimated, and I don't for 1 minute.
And could come to the fore this week. This is the problem. If you can't hammer out a compromise with Mr Grieve and with some of the other former Remainer rebels, you risk a government defeat on the floor of the House this week, which would surely seriously weaken the Prime Minister's authority.
Well, of course. I mean, we're in a position with a minority government, and each vote is meaningful, is vital. But just looking ahead and projecting ahead, if you were Michel Barnier and you were looking into the negotiation and looking into the future, it gives him a bit of a trump card to play when he knows that whatever the UK government might be saying to him now, he knows at the end of it there's a third party in this relationship, namely Parliament, who are going to get involved and trump whatever the UK government say. Now, that's not a good place for David Davis to be in. David Davis needs to be able to go out there and have a firm negotiating hand. And my worry about, however well-intentioned Dominic's amendment might be, my worry about it is that it actually plays badly in the most important negotiation, which is over in Brussels.
Except you'd agreed to it on Thursday afternoon before it was not agreed to.
No, the position was that we were looking at it. It looked like a reasonable way forward, but a decision was made.
But now it looks unreasonable.
Well, no, the decision was made. I was looking at all the options, and the government made a collective decision that what we wanted to do was to make it clear that when the vote came, that it couldn't be in some way some sort of direction to the government to change its tack and to send a signal to Brussels that really Parliament was the one that was actually a party to the negotiations.
But the language you've sent to the House of Lords for this vote, which would only take note of what had happened, you can't really describe that as a meaningful vote, really giving Parliament a meaningful say in this process, can you?
Well, as I was saying earlier, sir, every vote is meaningful, and it's the context of the vote that is so important. It's what is said in the chamber, what the feeling of the House is going to be. Whether it's a vote in the context of trying to extend the Article 50 process, for example, or even a debate about whether or not we should adopt the EEA-EFTA solution or stay in the single market. All these political scenarios can play out. And I think the real danger is that if we open the door to allowing our European negotiating partners to somehow think that, Parliament will be the final arbiter of all of this, that is not the way the British government should ever negotiate.
But they wouldn't be if all you had was an advisory motion. That does not make Parliament the final arbiter. It merely means that MPs get to advise the government on what they would like to go ahead. It doesn't tie the Prime Minister's hand. It doesn't fetter the negotiations in any way.
Well, except in very rare circumstances, motions of Parliament, unless they're prescribed by statute, aren't binding in that way, or indeed justiciable in my view. But there's a political context to all of this. And I'm hoping, of course, the government's policy is very clear. We want the deal, and I hope that all of this will be largely or wholly academic. Which is why we need to focus...
You want a good Brexit deal, you mean? But what you need first is a deal with Dominic Grieve and the rest of his rebels. And you're not making clear whether or not you're prepared to talk to them further about that. Is there space for further negotiations before this vote comes back to the Commons? Or is what you told him around about 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon the government's last and final offer?
Our position is to support the amendment as tabled by the government. Let's see what the Lords make of it. Of course, we have Tuesday to consider matters ahead of the Wednesday vote, but where we stand, we support the government's amendment as tabled.
But you keep telling us that the context of all of these votes is crucial, and if the government were to lose at any time, it could provoke a political crisis, and you're setting yourself up for a government defeat when this comes back to the Commons if you're not prepared to reach a compromise with Mr Grieve and his friends.
Well, we're being very clear about our position. We believe that we're in the right space now. We've won every vote last week. I believe that we can carry on in that successful vein, but I'm not going to gainsay what the Lords will produce. I've been involved in the weeds of this bill, Sarah, for many months now, and the Lords are just as important an element in this as the Commons.
But the government obviously thought you were going to... There was a significant possibility you might lose this vote in the Commons last week. That's why you were having these negotiations. That's why the Prime Minister herself had some of the rebels in and told them that they could trust her. To avert that crisis, you've kicked the can into next week, and now you're saying you're not prepared to do any kind of deal in order to avert what would have been a crisis last week is now a defeat that you can shrug off this week?
Well, I don't think we kicked the can. We actually moved things down in a constructive way. We improved upon our amendment in lieu by putting in that date of 21st of January in our new amendment, and we made progress on where we had been when the bill came back from the Lords. So, the idea that somehow we are just holding some sort of dam back, I think is not correct. We're making progress, but our position is very clear, Sarah. We want our amendment to pass, and we urge their Lordships tomorrow to pass it as is.
The accusation from Jacobs Rees-Mogg and some of the more ardent Brexiteers is that Dominic Grieve is trying to stop Brexit. Do you believe that's what his motion was intended to do, or even could have done?
Well, Dominic has gone on the record in the past to say that he doesn't want to stop Brexit. I think he said so again today, and I'll take that at face value, as I always do with everything that Dominic Grieve says. And we've talked a lot about good faith. I believe that good faith still exists, and that won't be breached by anything, certainly, that I do, or indeed the Prime Minister will do either.
Robert Buckland, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, let's pick up again with our panel on Brexit after the interviews that we had there with Dominic Grieve and Robert Buckland just a few minutes ago. And they both said some quite dramatic things. Lucy, Dominic Grieve was talking about that he was worried about bringing the government down. I mean, that's a fairly momentous thing to say.
Absolutely. I mean, you could see how anguished he looked, but at the same time, bloody-minded. I think that there is a feeling among people like Dominic and the pro-EU Tory rebels that for too long Theresa May's had her feet held to the fire by the ERG, the backbench Eurosceptics, and they're no longer willing to back down. And I thought it was remarkable that he, you asked him the question, do you understand that you could collapse the government next week if you vote against them on the meaningful vote, which you're so insistent on? He said, yes, we could collapse the government, and I lie awake at night in a cold sweat thinking about it.
So is that a threat or something he wants to avoid?
Well, no, it is a statement of fact. But again, if he wants to avoid it, it's really easy to avoid it and not ask for this meaningful vote. I'd like to just remind everybody that we did have a meaningful vote, and it was on June the 23rd, 2016.
But he sees this as a point of principle, and he made very clear why it was important to him that Parliament had a say and that he wasn't backing down.
And yet he also, at the same time, makes the point that, but it won't make any difference, because if we're in this situation, it'll be blatantly obvious to everybody, to the European Union, to the government, to backbenchers, to the people, that we haven't got a trade deal that's worth a fig, and the government will probably fall anyway. In which point, he doesn't need the meaningful vote. So he's saying he desperately needs something that's vitally important, but doesn't really matter. Well, which is it, Dominic?
He also said he was prepared to compromise, Steve, and possibly talk further with the government, but it wasn't clear from Robert Buckland that they were going to offer anything that might satisfy the rebels and stave off a revolt next.
What was so interesting about those two interviews is that you were interviewing two people wrestling with all kinds of dilemmas. We've discussed Dominic Grieve's dilemma. And Robert Buckland's dilemma is that while he can understand they're good friends, him and Dominic Grieve, Dominic Grieve's concerns, he can also understand David Davis's concerns. It was David Davis who intervened and got this all changed at the last minute. That David Davis is in this nightmare negotiation with Barnier, and he doesn't want another added complication with the other 25 layers. So he wasn't in a position to sort of offer any compromise. And frankly, it won't be up to him. And the stakes here are so high. This is one for, in the end, Theresa May to navigate, as she tried to do last week.
And it's one the government could lose this week when it comes back to the Commons. With the Lords on Monday, come back to the Commons later in the week. The government are facing a potential defeat again?
Unless they move. I'm told Theresa May's overwhelming priority, day by day, is not to lose votes. So I suspect she'll try and move again. But she's got David Davis breathing down the other side. And so she faces dilemmas every day as well.
There comes a point you can't fudge this any longer, and you have to go down on either side, the Leave side or the Remain side. The British
we say that absolutely
exactly, but we are hitting crunch point, aren't we? Because at the end of the day,
we say that every week too.
Exactly, this whole idea that sort of, oh, well, which way shall I go? The British public have told you which way to go. Your own manifesto tells you which way to go.